Okay, we're continuing our discussion of the attributes of God, and I believe this is where we left off yesterday with, with the steadfast love, the loyal love, the mercy, the chesed of God. It's interesting to see different theologians treat the idea of the chesed of God or the loving kindness of God. You'll see it in different. You'll see it divided up different ways. John Frame puts it under the concept of covenant love in its own section. Feinberg treats it more under the heading of mercy. So that's a great study, and I highly recommend that at some point you do a doctrinal series on the love of God and unpack for your congregation all the many different facets of the omnibenevolence of God. We have, I believe, one more under this category of omnibenevolence, and that would be truth or faithfulness. The two concepts have to be put together in the same, really in the same thought. The truth of God, or the trueness of God, could be broadly defined. I'm gonna drill down into it a little bit, but we could define it by saying God is the only authentic God, and all that He says and does is consistent with reality as He has decreed it. And that, as I was thinking about this during lunch just now, I thought this definition is probably a little bit overdrawn. It's probably not necessary to bring in the decree of God, but it does set the context. It sets the theological and the worldview context for God being true to reality by identifying reality as that which God has decreed. That's something we'll get into later on in our discussion of God. It's important, what's most important as we think about truth as an attribute of God, or God being true, what's most important in terms of the way that the Bible talks about truth is to understand that truth and faithfulness, or true and faithful, if we want to stick with modifiers, true and faithful are inextricably intertwined in the Scriptures, particularly in the Old Testament, which sets the pace, sets the tone for truth in the Bible. When you see emet in the Old Testament, emet is a broader concept than just a true proposition, an assertion that has a truth value of true as opposed to false. It's much more than that. It contains the idea of faithfulness. And so what I want to do is unpack the idea of God's truth or faithfulness in three senses that are divided out in your outline, in your class notes. And the first one we could call trueness. Only Yahweh is authentically God. Okay, so He alone is the true God. So trueness in the sense of authenticity. We've got wonderful biblical material on this from Isaiah chapter 44, and I just love this this passage where it talks about a man who cuts down a tree and the things that he does with it. He cuts down cedars, or he chooses a cypress tree or an oak, and lets it grow strong among the trees of the forest. He plants a cedar, and the rain nourishes it. Then it becomes fuel for a man. He takes a part of it and warms himself. He kindles a fire and bakes bread. Also, he makes a god and worships it. He makes an idol, and he falls down before it. Half of it he burns in the fire. Over the half he eats meat. He roasts it and is satisfied. He warms himself and says, "Aha, I am warm. I have seen the fire." We've all said that, haven't we? Sitting around the campfire. "Aha, I am warm." And the rest of it, okay, so you get the ridiculousness, okay? He burns in the fire, cooks over it, warms himself next to it, and the rest of it he makes into a god, his idol, and falls down to it and worships it. He prays to it and says, "Deliver me, for you are my God." Okay, and obviously the message here is how ridiculous that is. Okay? And the context continues to the point where the point that it drives to is that only Yahweh is the true God because only Yahweh delivers his people. Okay? In 1 Thessalonians 1:9, we have that phrase that Paul uses, the living and true God, where he's emphasizing the authenticity of God. Okay, so that's the one sense, trueness or authenticity. Second would be truthfulness, and this is what we tend to think of in English when we use the term truth or true. God's knowledge and declarations conform to his character. In other words, he always tells the truth. God always tells the truth. And the way that I've stated it here is simply just a broader way. God's knowledge and declarations. So everything that God knows is true, everything that God says is true, represents reality, and it conforms to his character in that faithfulness to represent reality accurately is a part of the character of God. It is a part of the character of God to always tell the truth. Okay, this is emphasized in Psalm 119, and this is an entire stanza of Psalm 119, but I think it's valuable for us to look at it as a whole. The psalmist says, "With my whole heart I cry, answer me, Yahweh. I will keep your statutes. I call to you, save me that I may observe your testimonies. I rise before dawn and cry for help. I hope in your words. My eyes are awake before the watches of the night that I may meditate on your promise. Hear my voice according to your steadfast love, your chesed, O Yahweh. According to your justice, give me life. They draw near who persecute me with evil purpose. They are far from your law, but you are near, Yahweh, and all your commandments are true. Long have I known from your testimonies that you have founded them forever." So the psalmist here, the point, the major point that's relevant to this discussion here is that the psalmist is persecuted. He sees the unfaithfulness of mankind, and he looks to God and to God's word as a source of truth, that in which he can ground his life. Okay, so God is a source of truth. Okay? And one of the main reasons that I included that passage instead of others that also communicate how God always tells the truth and God's words are always true, the reason I include that one is because you see the effect that that attribute of God is intended to have on us. Okay, as I said before, there are no non-moral attributes of God. They all have some sort of moral implication for both God and for us and for our relationship with him. So the fact that God always tells the truth and that his word is reliable, it has the effect on us of giving us stability and a source of confident hope. Okay? And then third, the third sense is faithfulness. All that God is and tells us is not deceptive. In other words, he is always true to his word. He's always true to his word. When God says something, he will bring it about. And here we see also the fact that emet is often paired with chesed in the Old Testament. They're often together. Faithful and true. Oh, Lord, you are faithful and true. So it's not just that he makes true statements, but that when he says something, he brings it about. He is faithful to his word. He'll always do what he says he's going to do. So the effect, the net effect of the attribute of faithfulness and trueness or truth is that we have a strong confidence in God. Okay? Questions? Comments? So, if you look back over the list of attributes, so we can call them sub-attributes, under this category of omnibenevolence. What we have are really just different perspectives of the love of God, different ways of describing how God expresses his goodness for the benefit of human beings and even creation in general. And I don't have in the class notes, in the course outline, I don't have an attribute called love, because you can't boil it down to one spot on an outline. I needed to give it these 5 different attributes. And if you go to Exodus, again, if you go back to Exodus 34, 6 and 7, which I took as my sort of my launching point for talking about this cluster of attributes, that's the way that God describes himself. Compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness and faithfulness. He keeps loving kindness for thousands. He's generous. He forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin. I didn't treat forgiving as its own attribute, because that is, again, one way that God expresses these other attributes. He is faithful to forgive. 1 John 1:9, that's the exact language that John uses there. He is faithful to forgive, because that is something that's in accord with his character. He tells the truth about sin, and he holds sinners accountable, or he always punishes sin, and that's something we'll get into in a minute. And yet, he has a stance of grace, compassion, and forgiveness, and patience towards sinners. So by far, the emphasis in God's self-revelation in Exodus 33 and 34 is on his love and his patience and his generosity. That's the emphasis. And I talked before, last time, about how, the old conception that the Old Testament presents God as the righteous, just, and wrathful judging God, as opposed to the New Testament, where it presents him as a God of love, is so fundamentally wrong. God's love and his generosity and his grace and compassion, that's built into the very beginnings of God's self-revelation in the early parts of the Old Testament, as far back as Exodus. And we see God manifesting those traits even earlier than that, back in Genesis after the fall, when he has grace on Adam and Eve and mercy on them and doesn't destroy them immediately, but provides for their continued life. And then we see the story of redemption begin right there. Now, the thing that I don't want to lose, after we look at the love of God from all these different angles, okay, and call it omnibenevolence, the one thing that I think is most important for us to see at the end of a discussion like that is this. Jesus said to his disciples, "A new commandment I give you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this, people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So the love of God is portrayed for us, explained to us, given life in the narratives of the Old Testament. So we know about the multifaceted love of God. The love of God becomes incarnate in the person of Jesus himself. The Son of God comes and demonstrates the love of God for us throughout his earthly ministry, and then ultimately in the sacrifice of himself on the cross. And in doing all of this, he says, "Go thou and do likewise." It does us no good to be able to describe the love of God if we don't give evidence of that same love in our own lives. If we're not transformed by this knowledge of God, John goes even further to say this. Having been in the upper room and heard Jesus give that command, that new command, okay, love one another as I have loved you. So the love of God flows to us in Christ Jesus tells the apostles, now you go and love one another in order to identify yourselves with me. John was there, and then he wrote this, Beloved, let us love one another. For love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. In this, and then he reviews, in this the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. In this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, so he gives the example, he reviews, this is how God loved us. And then he says, Beloved, if God loved us in this way, we ought also to love one another. No one has ever seen God. And we tend to stop right there and have some ontological discussion about the invisibility of God, when that's not the point of this verse. It's true, no one has ever seen God. But the reason John brings that up is so he can say this, if we love one another, God abides in us and his love is perfected in us. Following that train of thought, that no one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, people will see God in us. So it does us no good, and it does not fulfill the intention of God in revealing himself to us if we learn all of this stuff about the love of God, and then our lives and our churches, our ministries, our families are characterized by enmity, conflict. Okay? So, we've got to do theology in the first person. Learn about God, and then say, this is what my God is like, so this is what I'm going to be like. Questions before we move on? The omnibenevolence of God, the love of God expressed in all those different ways. Okay, let's move on. Moving now from the love or the omnibenevolence of God, we're moving on to some of the other attributes that are often characterized in the tradition as, as the moral attributes of God. We will get around to some of the other so-called non-moral or incommunicable attributes, hopefully today. God is righteous. God is righteous. What does it mean that God is righteous? It means that God always acts in accordance with what is right and is himself the final standard of what is right. Okay, so let's talk about this a little bit. Just a few very basic points that will help us shape this doctrine or shape this attribute of God. God epitomizes, he is the ultimate example of that which is right. Okay, Deuteronomy 32. Moses is speaking here. The rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice or righteousness. A God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he. Okay? All his ways are not just just, but justice. They are the example of justice. Psalm 11, verse 7. For Yahweh is righteous, he loves righteous deeds. The upright shall behold his face. Yahweh himself is righteous. He epitomizes that which is right. You want to know what's right? Look to him. And I give you a couple other examples in the class notes as well. So God epitomizes that which is right. Secondly, if you look throughout the scriptures, you chase the word righteous and righteousness around, particularly in the Old Testament, you'll encounter this term, the righteous one, and that refers to someone who imitates God. I'll give you Psalm 34 as an example because it develops that idea. Okay, the person who imitates God, who is obedient to God's character and God's standard, is called a righteous one, and that's someone who does righteousness. And then thirdly, we can't forget that Jesus, the Son of God, is called the righteous one in both the Old and New Testaments. In the great messianic passage of Isaiah 53, we have him given that name. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous. an Old Testament reference, a very clear Old Testament reference to justification. The Messiah would be the righteous one, and he would provide for making others righteous. He himself would make many to be counted righteous. Great Old Testament statement of the doctrine of justification. Okay? And then in the New Testament, we have a similar reference to Jesus when Peter says that Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous one for the unrighteous one. Adjectives used substantively there. So he calls him the righteous one for the unrighteous, so that he might bring us to God. Appears to be an echo of Isaiah 53. And that brings up the question, what determines right and wrong? You could tell it was getting late, and I was searching for images. How do you want to convey the ethical dilemma? Is an action right or wrong? I'm not sure why I came up with this one, but it works. Okay? The question is, what determines right and wrong? And you can look historically. These views were developed in the medieval period, but it really does represent two basic approaches to right and wrong. One of them, the realist view, essentially says that right and wrong are intrinsically what they are. Okay, so God chooses the right because it is right. What he calls good could not have been designated otherwise, because what is right is inherently of itself right. So, for example, there is intrinsic good in an act of kindness and inherent evil in an act of cruelty. Those standards are there. They're out there. And in a sense, God chooses kindness because kindness is inherently good. And then, of course, the other view says that God doesn't choose an action because of its intrinsic value, but God's choice of that action makes it right. So God's choices declare what is right and wrong. And of course, the implication of that is that God could have chosen to be cruel instead of kind, and in choosing to do so, his action of cruelty would define cruelty as right, at least in that case. Now, the flaws, and these, yeah, go ahead.
In saying what you just said, don't you have the same problem with what is cruel and what is not cruel?
I'm sorry, say that again?
If you choose what is cruel, and then therefore what is cruel becomes what is right, can we back up to say we have the same problem between cruel and not cruel as we do between right and wrong?
I think so, yes. That's the example there serves to show us that potential problem. What is the problem with a pure realist understanding of right and wrong?
Where did that come from?
Where did what come from?
Right and wrong, it's above God.
Okay, it implies that there's a standard outside of God, that somehow inherent in reality is a sense of right and wrong, that God himself is accountable to. So if you take your reaction to that, say, well, it can't be that way, and you go too far, you end up with the nominalist view. You say it's right because God says it's right. And what's the flaw in that thinking?
Who said cruel was cruel?
Pardon me?
Who said cruel was cruel?
Well, answer the question. Who says that cruelty is cruel? Who says that cruelty is bad? God does. So the second, the nominalist view, a pure nominalist view, implies that God is capricious. It implies that God has the possibility of acting apart from his own perfections. But God always acts in accordance with his character. That's why the definition of righteousness that we just looked at says that, has that second part. The second half of it says, and God himself is the standard of what is right and wrong. Okay? So God acts in accordance with his character, and his character provides the standard of right and wrong. So there would never be a position where sheer cruelty, okay, or evil, is called good simply because God chooses to do it. What God does is always in perfect agreement, perfect consistency with his own attributes and his own perfections. Yeah.
I was just going to ask, so basically, according to what you're saying, that example under the nominalist view, the only way that God could have chosen to be cruel is if he was cruel himself, because you're saying...
Yeah.
So they would have to say that God could have been a cruel God?
Right, yeah, nominalism would have to say that. God could have been a cruel God.
Would they go that far?
I don't know. That's where the view tends to lead, though. It implies that there's a standard, or it implies that God can act capriciously. Capricious means randomly, arbitrarily, and at a whim. Okay? So you have to kind of combine the strengths of these two ideas. Okay, God chooses right because it's right, but it's his own character that defines what is right. That's the difference. Right and wrong find their ultimate definition in the character of God. Okay, and God is always consistent with them. That does leave us with a few questions, though, before we move on to immutability. That does tend to leave us with some questions. And I give you the quote from Grudem there, who says essentially what I just said. Can God do things that we can't do? Is it possible for God to do, is it acceptable for God to do things that are wrong for us? Another way of asking that is, does the end justify the means for God? You can say, well, God can do anything he wants because his ends are always righteous ends. It's the ethical question. Can God do things that we can't do? An example that I give you there is deception. Is it okay for God to deceive where it's wrong for us to deceive?
Another example would be, we cannot use evil to get the result of good, but God uses evil, uses sin for the ultimate good.
Okay. Right. There's a difference, though. There's a difference. Because in order for me to use evil toward what I think is a good end, I myself have to commit evil. Don't I? I have to perform some evil action to bring that evil about in order to accomplish whatever I think the good end is going to be. Whereas in God's case, he himself is not sinning. He himself is not committing any sin. What he's doing is bending the evil will of his creatures, of his depraved creatures, in such a way as to direct their evil intentions in such a way as to bring about a good end that is not foreseen, by the evil creature, right? So God will sometimes bend the evil will of a human being in order to bring out a humanly unforeseen good event out of that wickedness. Carlos.
Can you provide an example of evil coming from God or God doing evil?
Okay. I can't give you an example of God doing evil, but we do have some... Yeah. We're going to get to the problem of evil on the last couple of sessions, but just as a preview, can anybody think of a biblical example where God used human evil to bring about... Yeah, Andrew.
Exodus 9, God hardening the heart of Pharaoh.
Okay, so God hardens the heart of Pharaoh in the whole process of the Exodus, bringing the Israelites out of Egypt.
The story of Joseph bringing Israel into Egypt through the evil acts of the people bringing Joseph.
Sure, yeah, rewind the tape a few hundred years and you've got Joseph's brothers who did an evil thing. And at the end of that story, Joseph twice says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. God brought me here. In, I think it's chapter 46, he says, God sent me here ahead of you in order to preserve life. Okay? They sold him to the Ishmaelites as a slave, okay, and they hauled him away into Egypt, and all those bad things happened to him. But Joseph's interpretation of that is, God sent me here. So his confession is that God somehow did this. When God had tolerated the wickedness of Ahab and his sons enough, time was up. What did God do? He employed a deceitful spirit to send Ahab and his sons out into a battle where they would be killed. So he brought about their downfall by means of a deceiving spirit. Okay? So God did not deceive them, but a spirit who wanted to do that anyway was permitted to do that in order to bring about their downfall. So those are some biblical examples where God employs the wickedness of human beings to bring about movements in his own redemptive program.
I guess that's what I guess God uses human evil
Yes.
rather than him causing or being the one who produces evil.
Right. God is not producing any evil. All he's doing is bending the evil actions of his rebellious creatures in such a way as to bring about something better than they intend. Yeah. Is there another hand?
I was just going to
Jim.
mention the example of Jesus' death.
Well, sure.
Acts 2 and 4.
Yes. Yeah, and we're going to come back to this under the problem of evil. We're going to talk about the concept of agency. And deception, though, does seem to be one that is appealed to fairly regularly, to say that, you know, God does something bad in order to bring about something good. There are times in Scripture where God seems to promote deception. Go ahead.
That would be the distinction I draw, though, is that all lying has deception, which is sinful, and God hates that. Not all deception is lying, and therefore God can tell people to deceive in certain ways, to withhold the truth from certain people.
Yeah.
So faking a hand, we can fake a handoff in football, and we haven't committed the sin of lying in doing
That's
that.
a good thing.
Because not all deception is by
Okay.
nature sinful.
Okay.
But lying obviously is sinful, and God can tell people, pretend like you're going to go up the front, but sneak around the back and attack them from behind when they
Right.
come out of the city.
Yeah.
God's not telling people to sin in that way.
Okay. So how is it that that kind of a deception is okay in God's eyes? It's obviously okay because God told them to do this. So talking about the Battle of Ai, for instance. So how is the second Battle of Ai, the one where they actually won? How is it that this is okay? Because it brings God glory. So how can I make the decision in my own life? This is a good deception because this will bring God glory. It's not for me to determine. So it's only okay if God directly tells me to.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Okay. So what's your answer to the question of hiding Jews and the Nazis knock on your door? Are you hiding Jews? What do you say? What do you do? Fake the handoff. Because deception is okay. Now there are good men and women who would disagree with you.
Lying verbally in that regard that's not deception, that's lying. Right?
It is.
That's the lie.
It's to assert a falsehood. Yeah, you read Wayne Grudem's work on this. He wrote a paper several years ago on lying. He presented it at ETS, and it was a very interesting discussion where he made the distinction that to assert something that's false is always a sin. To assert something that is false is always a sin. But there are kinds of deception that are not sinful, like withholding a part of the truth, or like a verbal sleight of hand, okay? Are you hiding Jews? Okay? Well, search the house. Okay? You will not find any Jews in my house. Okay? Or the one story of, I forget exactly, you've read these stories, but one of them where a little child in the home is scared by the intrusion of the Gestapo or whatever, and to the question, are there any Jews here, she says, they're under the table. Okay? There was a trap door under the dining room table, and there actually were people in a secret room down below there. But they didn't take her seriously because they could see it was a dining table and there obviously wasn't anybody underneath it. And in God's providence, okay, that deception brought about the preservation of life. People will disagree on that topic. The ethic, I mean, you could apply the same kind of philosophy, the same kind of decision-making thinking as the ethic of war, because you are at war in a situation like that. The same thing would apply to undercover cops. Okay, I've got several friends who are cops, and one of whom is an undercover cop. I mean, he has to have some sort of a spiritual rationale for the massive amounts of deception that he does on a regular basis. Okay, there's an ethic of war there that I believe is justified in the scriptures. War on evil that God has ordained through government, in order to suppress unrighteousness. But there would be some who would go with Grudem and say, but even in that context, you can't state things that are, you can't assert falsehoods. Yeah.
But even with, I think you do need something like that, like you were talking about with the ethic of war, because even with Grudem's thing, like some aspects, as long as you're not asserting a falsehood, you're fine. I mean, none of the parents in here would take that from any of their children if they told you a half truth. I mean, that is deception. I mean, that's a sin right there. And so there has to be something else going on rather than just you're not asserting a falsehood.
Yeah, it's one thing to distinguish lying from deception, but it's another thing to be a parent in that kind of context. Okay, and that's my bottom line. When I walked out of Grudem's session, that was my comment to the couple of guys that I was with at the time was, that's all well and good, but it doesn't answer all the questions because nobody who's a parent in here would accept that from their children. I didn't say anything that was false to you, Dad. Yeah, but you misled me. So, you're still grounded and your cell phone's gone for 2 months. So, you know what I'm saying? So, yeah, Brian.
This maybe doesn't have to do with deception, but higher orders of laws, like the law to save life trumps another law because you're preserving life.
Yeah.
Does that play into this?
Yeah, I mean, that principle is built into the Torah, that the preservation of life supersedes all of the other Torah's commands. I mean, not idolatry, But
then you're not actually lying,
you're obeying.
You're obeying.
Right. You're following a God-ordained hierarchy. Right. And you do have examples like that. Chris, and then we're going to move on.
Just thinking, just using your illustration, the comment with from Wayne Grudem's discussion. I think the end result is to glorify God. That's the kind of means.
Right.
If your child deceives you like that, intent obviously is not to glorify God.
Yeah.
We would certainly punish and full consequences.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Okay, good. Bottom line, though, we're talking about the attributes of God. God is always righteous, and his actions always conform to his own character, and his own character forms the basis for all judgments of right and wrong. And we understand the character of God in the scriptures so that we can make those kinds of judgments. But that doesn't mean that every judgment is going to be easy, because in our depravity, we either get ourselves into or we find ourselves in situations that are very difficult because of the depth of the depravity of the human race. Okay? Which is not to say that there is ever a situation where there's no choice but to sin. Sometimes you tell the truth and you face whatever consequences a sinful human being determines to impose. Okay, following along the idea of righteousness is the idea of justice. God is just. Justice can be defined as God's official righteousness in that he requires other moral agents to adhere to his standard. We could call that a definition of justice. His official righteousness, in other words, it's the the aspect of God's righteousness that requires compliance. Requires compliance. There's no slide for this, it's just in your notes. In the scriptures, we have God's judgment pointed to as the standard for what is final, what is correct. When God makes a judgment, he's right, and he cannot be forced or appealed to change his mind. When there's a judgment that's based on his righteous character. Okay? His judgment is final, and it is always correct. We'll just look at one example here. But because of your hard and impenitent heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself on the day of wrath, when God's righteous judgment will be revealed. Emphasizing the finality of God's judgment. Okay, the fact that God has not judged you already is no indication that he's waffling, that he's wavering in his judgment. What it does indicate is that your continual rebellion is a storing up of wrath, because God's judgment will come, and when it comes, it will be final. It will be complete. And the penalty for all of those sins that is pent up will rush forward, will rush out. Okay? So God's judgment is final, and it's correct. Biblical principle, God will punish evil. There is the biblical sense that righteousness requires that sin be punished. You know, the unbeliever's sense of this is that if God is loving, if he's a forgiving God, then he'll just forgive, right? Won't he just say, "Oh, don't worry about it. It's okay. Just don't worry about it." You know, kind of like that sweet old aunt that you have that just, you know, never really imposed any kind of a penalty on you. It's like, "Oh, that's okay." No, God's not like that. Righteousness requires that sin be punished. We could call that punitive justice. I give you the term punitive justice there. Throughout Psalm 7, but also 2 Thess 1. This is evidence of the righteous judgment of God, that you may be considered worthy of the kingdom of God, for which you are also suffering. Since indeed God considers it just to repay with affliction those who afflict you, and to grant relief to you who are afflicted as well as to us, when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven with his mighty angels in flaming fire, inflicting vengeance on those who do not know God and on those who do not obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus. They will suffer the punishment of eternal destruction away from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his might, when he comes on that day to be glorified in his saints, and so forth. Okay? So Paul is giving the eschatological look, the eschatological perspective on righteousness and wickedness. That day will come. God considers it just that sin be punished. And those who are punished for sin, may not be punished until the day that Jesus comes back, but it will happen. And when it happens, it will be final. Okay? So righteousness requires that sin be punished. And when that punishment comes, it will be complete. So that's the principle, that's sort of the negative side of justice. Punitive justice. The positive side we could call remunerative justice. Say it slowly. Remunerative justice is the idea, the sort of the general principle that righteousness receives reward from God. And again, this is a general principle. Proverbs 13:19. A desire fulfilled is sweet to the soul, but to turn away from evil is an abomination to fools. I'm not sure that's the proverb that I intended. But right there, unless it was, I may have been looking at a different translation at the time, where fools continue to flock to evil. But the contrast of that is a righteous desire that is fulfilled is sweet to the soul. The principle that righteousness receives receives its reward. Throughout the Psalms, we have a number of places where the psalmist will say that the Lord rewards righteousness according to its fruit, that God has rewarded me according to my righteousness. There's that sense of vindication, okay? But there, along with that, always comes the sense that righteousness is not always rewarded right away, and in fact, is sometimes not rewarded until the end of this life. So there's always got to be the long view. Always has to be the long view on remunerative justice. Okay, God will reward good, which is different from saying, from the false idea that God will reward those who do righteousness by saving them. Okay, people don't earn salvation. That's not the principle of remunerative justice. But the idea that there is reward for good things done is a biblical principle. And we see that eschatologically. We see that in the Bema Seat judgment, where Christians are rewarded for their for the good things that they did as the people of God, that they did after they were saved in their stewardship of what God had given them.
So can an unsaved person do good?
Can an unsaved person do good? The short answer is yes. And that is an evidence of what? Common grace, yeah. That's an evidence of common grace. That there are good things that happen in the world, and the good things that people do are the goodness of God broadly distributed to the entire human race. So there are philanthropists who do tremendous work. There are organizations that feed starving people, and those are good things that they do. Those are not salvific good things. And often those things are done out of a sense of personal superiority, a sense of trying to do something good with my life, as if the life is my life. And in that sense, it's what Dr. MacArthur calls bad good, It's bad good. So that's one way you could look at it. Those are genuinely good things. But even those are outflows of the goodness of God in the human race that he has made with the capacity to recognize right and wrong and to make choices with regard to those. So I'm very grateful for, people in the world who hate God but do good things. Yeah.
Well, so how does this kind of justice affect them? Is it only in this life they receive blessings because of the good they do?
Yeah,
or?
sure. Because no matter how much good you do in this life, that is only for this life. Okay?
Does that mean God will do good to them because they've done good in this life?
Proverbially, good actions receive, but again, that's not a promise from God that everything you do somehow has a remunerative value that deserves a certain amount of payment. It doesn't work that way. We all know it doesn't work that way. Okay? So, yeah, don't be afraid to admit that sinners do good things. But admit that in a Christianly way and say that even the good things that sinners do are evidence of the goodness of God. Yeah, there was a hand over here.
They're just rewards in and of themselves. That's the good that's done is...
Good is its own reward? In a sense, yeah, because, someone who gets a sense of gratification from adopting an orphan from Uganda, for instance. They get a sense of gratification that they've saved a child from a life of starvation or other kinds of abuse. That's a good thing. And the beautiful thing about it is they recognize it as good. And that's a point of contact where we can witness to the reality of God as a result of that. But it is its own reward, yes.
And so there's not some future point where God has to do anything else.
No, certainly not. There's no biblical idea that the good things that evil people do apart from saving grace somehow deserve some eschatological reward. There's no sense of that at all. biblically. Yeah, there's a hand over here. Yeah, Ryan.
If we attribute their good to the common grace of God, how do we still? I mean, shouldn't we testify that to the common grace of God, not to their action that's doing good? I mean, I wouldn't say that they're doing good if we attribute what they're doing good to the common grace of God. I would say it's the common grace of God that's.
No, it's their good intentions. Their sense of wanting to do something good is an evidence of the grace of God at work in the world. It's not as if God is adopting the orphan from Uganda. Okay, the person X, the sinner, who does not know God, is adopting the orphan from Uganda. But the reason they have those desires is because of the common grace of God, or you could say the general revelation of God in giving mankind a conscience and a sense of right and wrong. They do it. They're certainly doing that action, but that action is a testimony to the grace of God. It's God's common grace that motivates those things. That's the distinction that I would draw, which is not to ascribe any kind of salvific merit to a person who does that kind of thing. Okay, it's more complex than that. Okay, so yes.
Did you say that or implied that the satisfaction in so doing, in adopting his child, is the reward?
I think that's reasonable to say.
Can you assume also that God additionally will reward this person to, I don't know, provide for them to adopt another child? Would that work that way? I mean, I'm trying to get the sense in which you mean like God will reward good. Just a general statement. God will reward, the common grace, that which inspired a person to do such an action.
Well, the biblical theme of reward, of righteousness receiving a reward, is within God's people. That's the biblical sense of it. We're talking about unbelievers who do good things, who receive a reward for that. That's just sort of the way God has made the world. There tends to be a sense of gratification from doing something that you know is right. And we could say, it's reasonable to say that gratification is the reward, that the doing of good is its own reward. I'm saying it's reasonable to say that. I'm not claiming that's a biblical theme or citing book, chapter, verse in any way. That's a theologically reasonable thing to say within the scheme of general revelation and common grace. Yeah.
I'm just curious, so would they be punished for their bad good in the end?
So will they be punished for their bad good? Insofar as the good things we do are motivated by pride and a desire to be seen, then yeah, I mean, you're punished for the pride. I don't know that part of your eternal condemnation is based on the fact that you adopted an orphan from Uganda. That in itself is not an act of rebellion against God. But the hard actions of doing this in order to be seen or in order to, gain something, if that's the case, would definitely be a sin against God that constitutes a part of my condemnation. I would not go so far as to say that the good things the good things that sinners do are punishable. I wouldn't say that. I'm open to being persuaded, but that doesn't strike me as biblical. The good things that we do that are punished are, in Scripture, are portrayed as rebellious acts of the heart, like the self-righteousness of the Pharisees, and that kind of thing. Yeah.
I just was thinking of the example of Cornelius there in Acts.
Mm-hmm.
When it says, I think it's Acts 10, where God says that he's described as someone who feared God, and he gave alms to the Jewish people and prayed to God continually.
Okay.
And it says your prayers and alms have ascended as a memorial before God. Would he be outside of the realm of the type of individual we're talking about?
Yeah, in the case of Cornelius, I think that the prayers and alms that he had offered were not bad good, to continue to use the terminology. I think that when it says that he feared God, that was a way of identifying him as a proselyte. So he was a Gentile convert to Judaism. So he was, in that sense, he was an Old Testament believer. Until the Holy Spirit got a hold of him in Peter's presence, right, in the presence of the apostles, and the Spirit was given, and it was given, and the reason for that is to show that the Gentiles are also a part of the church on equal footing with the Jews. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a different situation. Good question, though. Now, just to kind of review where we've been. We began, Genesis 1:1, we see the self-existence of God. In the beginning, before there was a heavens and earth, there was God. So God is self-existent. He exists independently of the universe. He is not dependent on the universe. His existence is necessary, not contingent. And then we moved on to talk about God's self-revelation as a God of love, from epitomized and summarized in Exodus 33-34 in that narrative. And from that, I drew those traits of God's love, his omnibenevolence, compassion and grace and mercy, patience, truthfulness. And then at the end of that, Exodus 34:6 and 7, you also have the righteousness and justice of God. Okay, so the passage says, as God speaks his own name and his attributes, compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness and faithfulness, keeps loving kindness for thousands, forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin, and yet does not leave guilt or the guilty unpunished, but imposes the penalty, okay, visits the iniquity to the third and fourth generation, and so forth. So we have the love of God, the forgiveness of God, the patience, grace, mercy of God, and faithfulness listed right alongside the justice and the righteousness of God. We have the complete package there when we see that list as a whole. It's interesting, I think, that there is a tension in the way God revealed himself. That the first 6 attributes that are listed there are attributes that are all oriented toward the outpouring of love and grace and mercy. And that last one, it says, but he doesn't leave guilt unpunished. And then it just goes on from there. So how can a God who is compassionate and gracious and forgiving and patient and all this other stuff, how can he leave the guilty unpunished? How can he do that? And he doesn't say. He just leaves it. And he goes on and renews the covenant with Moses on that basis, on the basis of his glory as revealed in his attributes in the presence of Moses. So they're all together. And in my opinion anyway, that tension is left through the entire Old Testament. The tension stays. But Exodus 34:6 and 7 still stands as the paradigmatic revelation of the character of God throughout the Old Testament, and I told you that. 8 times that passage is quoted in part, or usually it's in part, to identify who God is and what he's like. All the way through, chronologically, all the way through the book of Nehemiah. And it just leaves it until the cross. Because it's at the cross that those attributes are fully expressed and are given their complete redemptive context. And the tension is resolved in Romans 3, 23 to 26, so forth. That they are justified as an act of grace in because God put forth his Son as a propitiation in his blood. Why did he do that? In order to demonstrate his righteousness at the present time, so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. So the justice of God that's left there at the end of Exodus 34:7, how is it that this just God can also be loving and patient and forgiving? The only way he can do that is by providing a substitute to take the punishment that's declared there in Exodus 34:7, the punishment that he inflicts. has to be meted out on a substitute so that God can be just and forgiving at the same time. So in Exodus 34, 6 and 7, you have a preview, or at least you have the question that leads to the answer of the cross. Okay? Which leads me to one of my other theories about the attributes of God, and that is you can take any one of the attributes of God, and as you study it, you end up at the cross. I haven't done that with all of them yet, but I think that's possible. Okay? All right. Let's move on. There's so much more to say, so much more to do here. We got to move on. The next attribute is the immutability of God. God is immutable. Here we're moving into what are often considered the transcendental attributes of God, the non-moral attributes of God, the incommunicable attributes of God, the immutability of God. Okay? This is exhibit 1 as evidence for my contention that there are no non-moral attributes of God. So let's begin. Definition. In the Old Testament, mountains are pictured as things that are immovable and unchanging, right? And Yahweh is sometimes identified as, I will lift my eyes to the hills from whence cometh my help. My help comes from the Lord. So the idea that God is immovable and immutable like the mountains. That's why I have a picture of the mountains. Sometimes I have to explain my imagery because the thought process doesn't translate to other brains. Okay. Very simple. Immutability can be defined as unchangeableness in essence, character, and will. God is unchangeable in his essence, character, and will. That is what we mean. That is what I mean when I say that God is immutable. Let's talk about the biblical evidence for this, the biblical rationale for this definition of immutability, because I'm going to show you that this definition represents somewhat of a departure from the Reformed scholastic tradition. Okay. How does the Bible describe God as unchangeable? Psalm 102:26. Speaking of the mountains, the works of his hands, basically creation, the psalmist says, and the foundation of the earth, probably referring to the mountains there, that which underlies them, and the heavens, they're the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will remain. They will all wear out like a garment. You will change them like a robe, and they will pass away. But you are the same, and your years have no end. Okay? Now, I would take this, we'll also come back to this under the eternality of God. God is eternal. But I would take this passage as an affirmation of the immutability of God, broadly speaking. God's being does not change. Okay? Heaven and earth will pass away, but God himself does not change. His truthfulness is unchanging. Numbers 23:19. God is not a man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. In other words, be unstable. Has he said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it? Okay? God himself will bring about his intentions. When God makes a promise, then it is an absolute certainty that that promise will be fulfilled. God always tells the truth, and he is always true to his word. God's plan is immutable, and this would answer back to the definition under the word will. Okay, his plan is immutable. Psalm 33:11, the counsel of the Lord, or the plans of Yahweh, stands forever, the plans of his heart to all generations. Okay, so God's plans do not change. It's not as if he makes one plan, and then if that doesn't work out, he goes, well, okay, we'll go with plan B. Sounds like open theism, doesn't it? Okay, directly controverts Psalm 33. His mercy is immutable. Psalm 103:17, we saw this last time. But the chesed of Yahweh is from everlasting to everlasting on those who fear him, and his righteousness to children's children. The mercy or loving kindness of God is immutable. It's an aspect of his character, isn't it? His faithfulness. His faithfulness. It's interesting to see how Malachi 3:6 is used in systematic theology textbooks or in theological treatises from earlier in church history. Malachi 3:6 says, "For I, Yahweh, do not change. Therefore, you, O children of Jacob, are not consumed." This is one of those passages where it's just repeatedly abused, because it's like at the semicolon in English, we stop reciting the verse. For I, Yahweh, do not change. See, God is immutable. Okay? Theologians have been doing this for centuries. Finish the verse, for heaven's sake. What is the point of Malachi 3:6? Tell me. He keeps his covenant. What did you say? Right. Because the Lord does not change, he keeps his promise to his covenant people. Okay? I don't change. Therefore, when I said before that I would not destroy you, that goes for now too. Even though you are once again proving yourselves to be miserably wicked and rebellious people. Okay? So the passage is not a general ontological statement about the unchangeableness of God. And theologians for centuries have been doing that, and it's increasingly annoying to see this passage get given completely acontextual treatment in theology books. That's the danger of proof texting, guys. Or you could say, well, Thomas Aquinas cited this verse, so it must be okay, right? Wrong. Right.
Isn't he making a statement, though?
Pardon me?
Is he not just making a statement?
He is making a statement about the unchangeableness of God. But what he's saying is God is unchangeable in this way. The way that this passage has been used, let me go one more. There's one more point here. His goodness. James 1:17, because this passage goes right along with Malachi 3:6 as one of the most misquoted passages. Every good gift and every perfect gift, or every good thing given, is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. There is no shadow cast by turning, no shifting shadow. There's 100 different ways to translate this verse. But the point of it is, every good thing that happens comes down from God, who is unchangingly good. But the passage is given is sort of abstracted, this statement that the Father of lights has no variation or shifting shadow. That part of the sentence is abstracted out and given this ontological meaning that God is fundamentally, metaphysically unchangeable. Where does this idea come from? Let's go back a long ways, although I'm not going to give you a history of doctrine here. One way of looking at the immutability of God, common way in church history, has been to remember the via eminentiae, the way of eminence. We think about God from the perspective of everything that we know to be good, and we attribute that perfection at its infinite degree to God. Okay? If God possesses, and so a common way of thinking about the immutability of God is to approach it from that point of view, or via that method. So let's think about God as a cluster of perfections. Okay? God is the being than which none greater can be conceived, and He is the sum of all perfections, the paradigm, the epitome of all perfections. So, if God is perfect in every conceivable way, and He were to change a little bit, then the only way that he can change is from perfection to something less than perfection, right? He can't change from perfection to something more than perfection or more perfect, because that would be to say that he wasn't fully perfect to begin with. So, if God is the sum of all perfections, and if it's true that for God, as the sum of all perfections, to change in any way, at any tiny degree, would be for him to move from perfection to something less than perfection, then God must be absolutely immutable in all conceivable ways. He must be immutable in all, unchangeable in every way that we can conceive of change. Right? Or so the argument goes. But what if a particular kind of change is itself a perfection? Isn't it better to change your regard for someone who is your enemy when they become your friend? If someone is your enemy, you have a particular stance toward that person. And if you're God, that person who is your enemy is deserving of your wrath. When that person changes and repents, is it not correct? Is it not perfect? Is it not an evidence of goodness for you to change in your regard for them? So maybe there is a kind of change that is itself a perfection. But in either case, what you see is the weakness of the way of eminence, the via eminentiae. You see the weakness of, or a potential weakness of, that particular kind of reasoning about the attributes of God. Because what it does is it kind of goes off on its own. It's a way of thinking, it's an employment of our reason that goes away from revelation to think by itself. If you take the medieval scholastic understanding, and I'm not even giving you, when we talk about eternality, I'll give you the rest of the picture, not giving you the argument based on divine simplicity or eternality and so forth. That's a part of the medieval scholastic way of thinking that's been handed down to us through the Reformation. But the temptation or the method brings about a kind of reasoning that is reasoning about God apart from God's self-revelation. Take that definition, that scholastic definition of immutability, and go to the scriptures to try to prove it. And the only way you can do that is to attach passages like Malachi 3:6 and James 1:17. But we've just seen that they don't say that. When the Bible talks about God being unchangeable, it always talks about the way in which he is unchangeable. He is unchangeable in his being, in that he is always God and never changes into anything other than God and doesn't decay or wear out. He's always unchangeably truthful. His plan is unchangeable because it's the best one available. His mercy, his faithfulness, his goodness are all unchangeable. God never abandons his goodness because he gets so angry. He never gets tired of sinners to the point where he reneges on his promises. He is always a good, merciful, loving, faithful, forgiving, just, and righteous God. That's the biblical idea of immutability. Questions? Yes?
Is that same thinking true for all the other attributes? We're not reasoning back to God in any of the other attributes, right? This is true, what you're saying in terms of what the Bible reveals about his immutability is true with all the other attributes?
I think so. Insofar as I understand your question, the answer is yes. Let me put it to you this way. This is F, A, B, C, D, E. We've already gone through 5 attributes of God. One of them had 5 parts to it. So we've gone through 10 attributes of God so far. And here, I followed the same method that I did with all the others. But I came to a conclusion that is significantly out of step with the Reformed tradition that is part of our inheritance, okay, of church history. I'm going to talk more about that in the next few attributes of God. We'll finish our discussion of immutability the next time we get together, work our way through a little more of the web of Tom.